I did not know how slowly a life could be entered. Not with thunder, not with the door kicked open, but ordinary things. Help with a bow for my daughter, advice over inspection reports, the quiet reassurance that a woman standing alone in the doorway of a house she is not sure she can trust might still call it home if someone steadies the frame. That is how it begins, perhaps. Not with ruin wearing its true name, but with usefulness, with kindness that arrives so often it starts to feel structural, with a man who folds himself in the scaffolding of your days so thoroughly that when he smiles it feels less like charm and more like a light being switched on in rooms you had forgotten were dark. He was there, in the language of routines, in the errands and practices and missed events and the small practical mercies that make a woman exhale. He was there, in my life, in my daughter's life, in the chatter of archery seasons, in the shape of gear and schedules, and the way a person can become familiar not by grand declaration, but by repetition, by frequency, by showing up so often that your nervous system mistakes them for permanence. And what is more dangerous than that? Not a stranger, not a villain with teeth bared, but someone who becomes part of the daily weather, someone your life starts dressing around, someone whose permanence settles so deep into the grain of things that even your child learns the outline of his voice. You call him your best friend because that is the nearest honest word you have at the time. You call it support, you call it guidance, you call it friendship, because what else are you supposed to call a man who helps carry not just your burdens, but the future you are trying to build with your own two hands? A woman raising a child does not take trust lightly. She does not pass out access to her hours, her grief, her home, her hope like breath mints in a waiting room. No, trust is expensive. Trust is a currency paid in vigilance. Trust is letting someone near the tender machinery of your real life and hoping they do not learn which wire to cut. And then he asked me closer to the department, closer to his orbit, closer to the future he said I could have there. He saw my past like proof of usefulness, my service, my training, my discipline, and he said I belonged. So I came. I stepped into that world partly because he called me toward it, partly because I wanted something more from my life, and partly because when someone who already lives inside your trust tells you there's room for you too, it is hard not to believe the invitation is clean. But even then, something in me knew enough to tremble. I knew there was already an emotional current beneath us. Knew enough to name it. Knew enough to try to build a dam. I said no to romance. I said, let this be professional, platonic, clean. I said I needed the line to hold. And for a while, I tried to hold it with both hands. Tried absence, tried distance, tried missing things I wanted so badly to attend just to keep my own heart from slipping its leash. But boundaries are hard to maintain when the other person keeps leaning against them softly, with a smile, with a text, with one more reason to remain emotionally lit. What name do you give to someone who says he understands the line while tracing it with his finger until it blurs? He watched for me in town, watched for my car, watched my route, noticed my whereabouts, commented on my location as though vigilance were affection, as though being observed was another dialect of being cherished, and I, foolish or trusting or merely human, took it of some kind of care. Because that is the great theft of it, is it not? Not simply that harm is done, but that it is done wearing the borrowed clothes of devotion. He made himself central to training, to guidance, to progress, to advancement, to all the doors that seemed open faster when his hand was on the latch. He became the one signing off, the one teaching, the one correcting, the one returning to material others had shown me, as if no knowledge counted unless it came from his mouth. And somewhere in that arrangement something tightened, not loudly, Not enough at first, but for anyone outside the room to hear the string. Just the subtle making of a private gravity. Just the gentle rearranging of a world until one person becomes the axis around which it turns. And then the crossing. Late at night, after good night had already been said, because endings were never his specialty, only extensions, only the reopening of doors after he had theatrically closed them. A request, a tattoo, a little more, a little deeper, a little further into the hour where people stop pretending their choices are accidental. Then fire in the dark, a call after midnight, a return home, a threshold crossed in words first, then feeling, then flesh, and after that, everything accelerated the way storms do once the first branch gives way. Love named first, future named itself, marriage entered the conversation, not as joke, but as architecture. We built whole countries out of maybe. We furnished rooms inside a life not yet lived. He spoke of children, of holidays, of shared shapes of time, of the kind of tomorrow that makes a woman unclench all the old fists of her chest. He said my constancy made him feel love, said my steady communication felt like respect. He taught me the rhythm he wanted and then received it gladly until the same tenderness could later be recast as too much. That is a particular cruelty. To be handed the script, praised for reading it faithfully, then condemned when the final act requires a scapegoat. I was brought into hidden rooms, into closed door spaces, into corners where secrecy pretended to be intimacy, into stolen moments that always seem romantic until later. When you understand secrecy does not shelter love, it starves it. Still, I believed, not because I was witless, not because I was desperate, but because belief is what happens when words and actions walk side by side for long enough that doubt begins to feel almost insulting. And because he did not offer me a single glowing lie, he offered me accumulation, evidence, frequency, the illusion made durable by repetition. He involved me in his world, in his children, his holidays, his habits, his clothes, his future tense. He asked me to show up, asked me to respond, asked me to orient myself toward his presence, his needs, his shifts, his emergencies, and I did. Then came the part where truth stood in the doorway and could no longer be delayed. His marriage, his wife, the conversation that had to happen, the week spent circling that cliff's edge like two people trying to call cowardice caution. He wanted continuation without confession. I said no. She deserved truth. Even then, even loving him, even tethered to him, even wanting him, I still knew there were some injuries you do not pass on to another woman just because a man is afraid to look directly at what he has done. So we waited for the reckoning as if naming it together might soften the fall. And in that waiting, he leaned harder, called more, needed more, spoke of outcomes, of logistics, of what might happen after, of where he might stay at my house, of what life might look like when the truth had finally broken open. How was I not to believe him? He had already made me a witness to his unraveling, already placed in my hands the fragile theater of his despair. He spoke of self-harm more than once. Enough that concern became its own cage, and my love, already overextended, was handed one more burden to carry, his survival. And every woman who has ever loved someone in pieces knows the trap of that. How quickly care can become obligation. How easily fear can be used to sew a person into place. How love, when mixed with panic, stops feeling like a song and starts sounding like a monitor in an emergency room. So I stayed attentive, stayed reachable, stayed emotionally on call. And then When the truth finally came due, he stepped back from the very fire he had fed with both hands. He began to blur the story, to shrink his role in it, to reshape the architecture so that I looked like weather and he looked like wreckage left in my wake. Suddenly, the mutual became one-sided. Suddenly, the chosen became pursued. Suddenly, the man who had built 1,000 tiny bridges toward me stood on the far bank asking why I had crossed. That is not confusion. That is betrayal with paperwork. Then came the voices, the names, the community's appetite for a woman they can simplify. Homewrecker, problem, threat, someone to be discussed in corners by people who were never handed the full ledger. And when I defended myself with proof, with screenshots, with the receipts of a reality that had not been mine alone, I was still the one expected to carry shame like a polished heirloom and keep smiling through the weight of it. He blocked, returned, withdrew, reopened. He vanished. He reached back again and again. The same cruel pendulum, the same door learning how to injure by swinging. And what is a heart supposed to do when that kind of inconsistency except remain standing in the hallway, bleeding and confused, still listening for footsteps? Because intermittent mercy is its own form of violence. Not enough to heal, not enough to keep hope alive, enough to make severance look temporary, enough to turn certainty into quicksand. So when messages were sent, they were sent from inside that confusion, inside a pattern he himself had trained into being, a cycle of rupture and return, a language of stop and come back, spoken so many times that finality had no longer had a trustworthy face. And then came the accusation, as if history could be erased by choosing a harsher noun, as if reciprocity could be buried beneath official language, as if a relationship does not leave habits in its wake, as if tenderness once cultivated daily can be switched off without confusion, without grief, without the stunned flailing of a person trying to understand which version of reality they are now expected to inhabit. I think that is the part of the wound too. Not only losing him, but losing the story of what had happened at all. To be loved and then denied, to be invited close and then named the trespasser, to be drawn into a web and later handed the blame for being caught in it. There are injuries deeper than abandonment. There is being made to question your own calibration of truth. There is being taught that sincerity can be weaponized against you if the other person becomes frightened enough of consequences. There is learning that a man may call your devotion beautiful right up until the hour he needs it to look dangerous. And so now fear has entered the ordinary things, the station, the route I run, the act of showing up, the simple human movement of existing where I have every right to exist. Even poetry, the old lantern of mine, has begun to flicker under the pressure of being watched. Because I write, because I have always written, because language is how I survive what would otherwise calcify inside me, and yet now, even that feels shadowed by the possibility that a woman telling her own story will be treated as another offense, but the page still knows me. The page does not ask me to make myself smaller for someone else's comfort. It does not require me to amputate my own memory to preserve a cleaner public image for the man who helped create the wound. The page only asks for truth, and the truth is this: I loved him. Not vaguely, not theatrically, not as some passing indulgence I could shrug off with a better playlist in a busy week. I loved him with the seriousness of a woman who had already survived enough to know better than to use that word lightly. I loved him while trying to be ethical. I loved him while trying to maintain boundaries. I loved him while insisting another woman deserved honesty. I loved him even when fear began walking beside that feeling, and that love does not protect me. Nor did honesty, nor did restraint, nor did the effort to do right inside a situation already bent crooked by secrecy. But remains now is not romance. It is aftermath. It is anxiety in daylight. It is glancing at familiar places and seeing ghosts in uniform. It is wondering whether retaliation will be dressed up as policy. It is feeling the perimeter of your life for breaches that did not used to be there. It is remembering the watching, the drive-bys, the comments on locations, the red light, the speeding city vehicle, the history of threats, and realizing too late that once read as longing also carried the shape of something darker. It is grief made complicated by evidence, because it would almost be easier to mourn a clean villain, a simple liar, a man with no soft moments, no real laughter, no tenderness that seems sincere. But that is not the story. The story is harder. The story is that love and harm can occupy the same body, that someone can mean parts of what they say and still become dangerous when consequences arrive. That affection can be real and still not be safe. That a person may reach for you with one hand while using the other to preserve himself at your expense. That is the heartbreak. Not merely that he hurt me, but that he was once a place I set down my armor. And now, even memory feels like walking through a house where the floorboards know exactly where they split. Still, I am here. Afraid, yes. Wounded, yes. Changed in ways I would not have chosen, but here. Still writing, still telling it, still trying to gather my life back of the hands that rearranged it. I do not know yet what justice looks like for a thing like this. Sometimes it is not a courtroom. Sometimes it is not an apology. Sometimes it is not even vindication. Sometimes justice is simply refusing to let the truest version of events be buried beneath a convenient one. Sometimes justice is naming confusion, confusion, naming betrayal, betrayal, naming fear, fear, and refusing to call it madness just because it happened inside a woman's chest. Sometimes justice is surviving the story without surrendering authorship. So let this stand, not as revenge, not as spectacle, not as a plea for strangers to sort the bones out of. Let it stand as a record of how easily care can become control, how quickly intimacy can be repainted once self-preservation takes the brush, how deeply a woman can be altered by loving someone who invited her close and then condemned her for knowing the way to be close. Let it stand for the mother who thought she was building trust, for the volunteer who thought she was finding purpose, for the writer who now trembles at her own publication dates, for the runner who should not have to second guess the streets beneath her feet, for the woman who tried to do right and still found herself cast as the ruin. Let it stand because silence has already taken enough, and if my voice shakes, let it shake. Lanterns do that too sometimes, especially after wind. They tremble, they gutter, they nearly go out, and still, against all that dark, they go on burning.